Welcome back to Backstage Melody. What if Journey's biggest anthem wasn't about heartbreak, but a secret farewell? Because when Steve Perry sang Separate Ways, he wasn't just losing love, he was losing the band. This wasn't a breakup song, it was their breakup song. By 1983, Journey was living the dream, or so it seemed. They were rock royalty, multi-platinum albums, sold-out stadiums, anthems echoing from car stereos and high school gymnasiums across America. To fans, they were untouchable. Steve Perry's voice could shatter hearts and raise the roof in a single note. Jonathan Cain's keyboards added emotional gravity. Neal Schon's guitar cut like lightning through every track. They were unstoppable, at least that's how it looked on stage. But fame at its peak doesn't reveal the cracks, it hides them. Behind the velvet curtain, Journey was barely holding together. Steve Perry was crumbling under the weight of expectation. He wasn't just the lead singer, he was the brand. Every magazine cover, every interview, every emotional hook in their biggest hits came from him. And yet, the grief never left him. Just a year earlier, he had lost his mother, Mary, and it shook him to the core. She wasn't just family, she was his tether to home, to humility, to reality. With her gone, Perry felt adrift in a world that suddenly felt fake. But there was no time to process it. The label needed another album, the tour calendar was booked solid, and the fans were chanting his name. So, he showed up, but only the part of him that the world expected. The other part? It was quietly fading. In the studio, the tension was palpable. Jonathan Cain noticed it first. The once seamless songwriting process was now awkward and forced. Perry was quieter, less patient. Neal Schon, eager to push the band's sound into darker, edgier territory, began clashing creatively with both Perry and Cain. Where they once finished each other's musical sentences, they now spoke entirely different languages. Still, no one dared say it out loud, because the image mattered more than the truth. And the truth? The journey was burning out, fast. They were riding the high of success. But emotionally, they were already miles apart, living separate lives on the same stage. Separate ways, worlds apart, hits like an earthquake, loud, urgent, unstoppable. To fans, it was another powerhouse Journey anthem. But what they didn't know was that beneath the pounding drums and soaring vocals, this song wasn't just about heartbreak. It was heartbreak, not from a failed romance, but from a band slowly falling out of love with itself. The song was written in a moment of emotional exhaustion. Steve Perry and Jonathan Cain were holed up in a hotel room during a brutal tour stretch, both physically present, emotionally elsewhere. They weren't chasing a chart topper that night. They were just trying to cope. Cain brought in a riff. Perry mumbled a few lines. Then suddenly, they both locked in, not with excitement, but with relief. They weren't writing a hit. They were bleeding onto the page. Someday love will find you, break those chains that bind you. It reads like a message to a lost lover, but in reality, it was Perry wrestling with the invisible chains tightening around his own spirit. He wasn't free, not from the grief, not from the pressure, not from the image he had to uphold as Journey's frontman. And with every lyric, he was writing his own quiet rebellion. Jonathan Cain would later admit, "We knew something was breaking, maybe not the band itself yet, but something inside of us." That confession shaped the song more than any chorus or riff. Separate Ways became a coded cry for help, a way of saying goodbye without using the word. And Perry? He delivered the vocals like it was his last chance to be understood. You can hear it in every strained note. It wasn't just heartbreak, it was resignation. This wasn't the sound of a couple drifting apart. It was the sound of a band at war with itself, disguising pain behind stadium-sized sound. And once the track was finished, they all knew. This wasn't just another Journey hit. This was the beginning of the end, wrapped in 4 minutes of thunder. Separate Ways sounded like a triumph, loud, electrifying, unstoppable. But when the cameras started rolling for the music video, the illusion shattered. The band met in New Orleans to film what should have been a slam dunk, Journey's first foray into the visual-dominated world of MTV. But from the very beginning, something was off. The location, an empty industrial wharf on the Mississippi River, was bleak and uninspired. The concept, confusing at best. The band would mime their instruments without actually playing them, performing in the open air with no crowd, no stage, no context. Steve Perry hated it. He wasn't subtle about it either. You can see it in his body language, pacing awkwardly, fists clenched, gaze distant. He looked less like a rock star and more like a man trapped in a scene he didn't want to be part of. Perry later called the video an embarrassment, not just because of how it looked, but because of what it revealed. He felt exposed, performing a deeply personal song in a way that stripped it of meaning. Neal Schon did his best to play through the discomfort. Jonathan Cain stared straight ahead, barely blinking, his hands awkwardly pretending to play a keyboard bolted to a warehouse wall. There was no chemistry, no unity. Just 5 musicians going through the motions, surrounded by wind, tension, and silence. What was meant to be a statement of power became a symbol of detachment. Even fans noticed it. MTV aired the video, but audiences were puzzled. Comments trickled in. Why does Steve look so mad? Why are they pretending to play? Are they even still friends? The truth? They weren't, at least not in the way they used to be. This wasn't just a bad music video. It was a snapshot of emotional decay. A visual timestamp marking the exact moment when the band's internal fractures became impossible to hide. And once it aired, there was no denying it anymore. The song might have masked the pain, but the video exposed it for all to see. Steve Perry was the voice of Journey, soaring, powerful, unforgettable. But beneath that flawless delivery was a man quietly unraveling. By the time Frontiers dropped and Separate Ways climbed the charts, Perry was running on empty. He had spent years chasing perfection, carrying the weight of the band's success on his shoulders. But success had a cost, and he was the one paying the bill. The loss of his mother in 1982 had devastated him. She had been his rock, his grounding force, the one person who truly understood who he was beyond the spotlight. And now, with her gone, Perry was adrift. He didn't grieve publicly. He didn't fall apart on camera. Instead, he went silent. That silence became his armor. He showed up for interviews, but his answers were shorter. He walked on stage, but he disappeared backstage. He performed because he had to. But the joy was fading fast. The pressure didn't stop. If anything, it intensified. The label wanted another hit. The fans wanted another tour. The band wanted him to keep showing up like everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine. Jonathan Cain later recalled that Perry started pulling away during writing sessions. Not out of ego, but exhaustion. He wasn't just tired, he was grieving, emotionally spent, and starting to question if any of it still mattered. And on stage, even as his voice hit every note, his eyes told another story. They didn't shine the way they used to. They looked distant, like he was somewhere else, miles away from the cheering crowds. Backstage, Perry would often sit alone. He didn't want to talk. Sometimes he'd disappear for hours with no explanation. And the band, though concerned, had no idea how to reach him, because Steve Perry didn't explode. He imploded, quietly, slowly, completely. Separate Ways wasn't just a song he sang, it was a message he was living. The emotional chains, the feeling of being trapped, the fading connection to what once inspired him. It was all there. He wasn't just performing lyrics, he was confessing through them. And the saddest part? Most people never realized it until long after he was gone. On paper, the Frontiers tour was a victory lap. Sold-out stadiums, screaming fans, a multi-platinum album soaring through the charts. From the outside, Journey looked like a well-oiled machine, bigger, louder, and more unstoppable than ever before. But inside that machine, the gears were grinding. What fans didn't see was the emotional toll that tour was taking. More than 70 shows across multiple continents. No downtime, no breathing room, just pressure. Always pressure. Steve Perry was buckling under the weight. He'd walk off stage to thunderous applause, only to sit alone in silence moments later. The cheers didn't comfort him anymore. They haunted him. They reminded him of everything he no longer felt. Joy, excitement, connection. Jonathan Cain could feel the walls closing in. The tension between bandmates was thick enough to cut with a knife. The small disagreements about set lists, tempo, who should speak in interviews became personal. Because when people are burned out, everything becomes personal. Neal Schon retreated into music, often escaping into side projects just to clear his head. He wasn't trying to abandon the band, he was trying to breathe. But even that decision added to the sense of drifting apart. On stage, they still delivered the goods. Every night was explosive, dramatic, and tight. But it was all muscle memory. The chemistry that once made them great had faded. They weren't playing with each other anymore. They were playing through each other. And behind closed doors, the silence was deafening. Steve's absences became more frequent. Sometimes he wouldn't show up until minutes before a show. Other times, he vanished right after the encore. No words, no eye contact. The crew whispered. The band exchanged looks. No one said it, but everyone felt it. This wasn't just a hard tour. It was a slow, grinding collapse happening in real time. And the worst part? They still had months to go. Years after the dust had settled and the lights had dimmed, Jonathan Cain finally said what everyone had long suspected. Separate Ways wasn't just a breakup song, it was our breakup song. At the time, fans thought the lyrics were about lost love, emotional distance, and longing, and they were. But not in the way people assumed. Cain, who co-wrote the song with Steve Perry during one of the band's darkest chapters, later admitted that the pain behind it wasn't just romantic, it was personal. The kind of pain that builds between people who've been through everything together and suddenly don't recognize each other anymore. He described the writing session as intense but strangely quiet. There was no celebration, no lightness. Just two exhausted men channeling everything they couldn't say out loud into melody and lyric. Someday love will find you, break those chains that bind you. To a casual listener, it sounds like a hopeful promise. But for Cain and Perry, it was a confession. Those chains weren't about another person. They were about the music, the pressure, the band. The identity that had once freed them now felt like a prison. Cain later said Perry's vocal performance shook him, not because of the power, but because of the truth in it. There was something final in Steve's delivery, something that made Cain feel like Perry wasn't just singing through the pain, he was preparing to walk away from it. And he was right. Looking back, Cain admitted they were writing something they didn't want to admit was real. They were putting a period at the end of a sentence they weren't ready to finish. Separate Ways wasn't just a hit. It was a slow, poetic surrender. And the most haunting part? They didn't fully realize it until Perry was already gone. When the Frontiers tour ended, so did the version of Journey the world had fallen in love with. But there was no dramatic breakup, no emotional press conference, no final moment to mark the end. Steve Perry simply disappeared. There were no farewell words to the band, no promises of "see you next album," just silence. He slipped out of the spotlight the same way he once owned it, quietly, mysteriously, and on his own terms. At first, the band waited. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Phone calls went unanswered, studio sessions were postponed. Everyone around them kept asking, "Is Steve coming back?" But no one had the answer, not even Steve himself. It wasn't a fight that ended Journey, it was distance. An emotional and spiritual drift that had started years before and finally reached the point of no return. Eventually, the band regrouped to record Raised on Radio in 1986. Perry returned briefly, but something had changed. His voice was still golden, but the heart wasn't in it. He was there, but not present. Visible, but far away. The energy that once flowed effortlessly between them had evaporated. Even the tour for that album felt like a contract, something to complete, not something to enjoy. And when it was over, so was he. This time, there was no coming back, no reunion, no encore, just a vanishing act that would haunt the band for years. To the fans, Steve Perry's exit felt sudden. To the band, it felt like the slowest goodbye in rock history. Because he didn't need to say the words. He had already said them, in separate ways. He had already written the farewell, recorded it, and sung it on stages around the world. No one realized it at the time, but the song that united millions was the same song that quietly tore Journey apart. And by the time the world figured it out, Steve Perry was long gone. Separate Ways became one of Journey's most iconic songs. But for those who knew the story, it was more than just a power ballad. It was the sound of heartbreak, of loss, of goodbye. Not to a lover, but to a dream, to a brotherhood, to Journey. So, the next time you hear it, listen closely. Beneath the anthemic chorus is a farewell whispered between the notes. If you love emotional stories behind classic songs from the 70s to 90s, hit subscribe. We drop a new story every day, right here on Backstage Melody.